So, things. Thing number one, stuff's due tomorrow. I know you know that, by the way. Thing number two, I apparently didn't post the quiz quite correctly, but no one tried to take it and tell me yet. So I think I fixed it. However, if you try to take the quiz and you don't seem to have access to it, please let me know. Thing number three, somebody has emailed me like 6 times. It's the same person. I'm saying that they can't get access to the weekly questions that are due tomorrow. And because so many of you have turned them in and I've actually graded some of them, I'm pretty sure you have access to them. But if that's an issue, that person's emailed me probably 4 or 5 times and I've emailed back 4 or 5 times with suggestions. So I think that's just an individual person issue. So, but if you do have an issue, feel free to email and I'll try to get back to you. Knowing, of course, that I'm not going to be good at tech help. Sorry, I'll do what I can, but you know. What's the other thing? Oh, the weekly questions for next week and for units 3 and 4. I did post lists of those in the course documents page. So you can look there for those and should be able to have access to them. I haven't put them in the, hey, I'd like to turn it in page, the assignments page, because I figure you're still working on this stuff and I'll probably load those next week. Also, after the quiz, after you take the quiz, excuse me, look for a survey that asks you about the quiz. Kind of, did you like it better than the first one? Do you like 20 questions rather than 8 or 10? That sort of thing. But I'm going to wait till you take the quiz and see your grade before you decide that, okay? And then I'll probably ask you again if you thought that the suggestions, study suggestions were helpful. Again, knowing college class, I'm not supposed to tell you everything. Some stuff's supposed to be hard, you know what I'm saying. All right. And other question that I had a couple times was, what's the deal with the book review? Do we have to do it? How does it figure into our grade? That sort of thing. I'm going to remind you always that when you have questions about the grade, be sure to look at the syllabus, because I tried really hard in the syllabus to explain how the grading system works. Doesn't mean I was successful, but there might be information there that helps you. This person asked, do you have to turn the book review in? Is it a required assignment? The answer is no. And, but, always a but, you have to do it if you want an A. So if you want an A, you have to do the book review. And then somebody asked, is it extra credit? Essentially, yes. Yeah, essentially, yes. And then someone else was upset because I could tell they were upset because of how they wrote it. Like, oh, sorry. Because they don't think their grade is properly reflected in the online gradebook in Blackboard. And, you know, when I grade the stuff, the grade goes automatically into that gradebook. I don't enter it. So I'm pretty sure it's accurately reflected. I think the concern was that it showed point total instead of percentage. I might be able to change it to where it shows both, but you know, to this point, like the first unit was worth 70 points. So they were upset because their grade was like, it said they had a 70. And they said, well, I got almost all the points. How can I have a 70? It's because you are a 65. It's because you got 65 out of 7. So what it shows in there is how many points you have out of how many points were possible of the things I have currently graded. Now, for some of you, I've already graded your first question, the chapter 18 one. So you have 80 points possible instead of 70. But it should show you what you have out of how many points were possible. And if you divide smaller number by the larger number, that gives you your percent. That's all the math I'm going to help you with. No calculus, any of that kind of stuff. All right. I think that's all the pre-class stuff I wanted to talk to you about. If you guys have any questions you want, excuse me. Sorry. If you guys have any questions you want to ask at this time, either shout them out, type them in, whatever you think works. All right. I was looking to see what flavor. Cherry limeade. All right. Okay. So let's see. Let's look at the weekly question just as a reminder. Identify the change in American politics and society brought about by the New Deal. Mention specific laws, philosophies, or politicians in this discussion. Okay, so I think the general thing I would talk about as far as changes would be the idea that people now, voters, American public, now expected that the federal government would be involved in fixing problems, that they expected them to fix the economy when it got this bad and to help the American people if they couldn't help themselves. So that's a big change. And the way Foner talks about it is how they viewed liberty, of course. You know, give me liberty. What is freedom? The freedom to be able to get a job, to be able to pay your own bills. Before, people saw that as best supported by the government staying out of things. Then in the 20s, maybe best supported by the government helping business. And then in the 30s, best supported by the government regulating business so that we wouldn't have another Great Depression, and helping individuals so that they, even though they didn't have a job, they could afford food and a place to live, that sort of thing. So to assist people when they needed help and to regulate businesses so that the system wouldn't collapse again. So people see a change in the role of government. They want the government to step in and regulate and help, that sort of thing, which is definitely a shift from the 20s. Excuse me. I would also mention economic philosophy of John Maynard Keynes, potentially, about how planned deficits and the government spending money that they really don't have might make sense in time of economic crisis where it doesn't make sense in other times. So the idea that the only entity that can fix a depression of this sort is going to be the government. And the book talks a little bit about Keynesian economics, and just enough for a history class. So this is not an economics class, so you can talk a little bit about, you know, what the book says about Keynesian economics. And what else philosophically? And you notice too, like even in the modern era, where we kind of think the government should stay out of our business, that sort of thing, a lot of times. When there's a crisis, say a pandemic or something, and you see the economy go into a little bit of a tailspin and unemployment double and triple, we don't mind that the government cuts $1,200 checks to people and sends them out, and maybe would like for them to send a second one. So, you know, our philosophy of government does sometimes change by the circumstance or what we think government's role in our life should be. So, you know, I think you see that change here in the 30s. Politicians, you got to mention FDR. Clearly, I think that's clear. But you could also mention, you know, you could contrast Herbert Hoover with FDR if you want. You could talk about FDR plus other politicians of the era, maybe Huey Long or, oh gosh, was Alf Landon the one who runs? It is the one who runs against. You could talk about opposing points of view, but the main politician you need to talk about in this answer is FDR. I think that makes the most sense. And let's see, laws, pick a couple of New Deal agencies. And I would probably pick a couple that did different things. You know, maybe some that regulate, some that create jobs, some that just give out cash. So, and if you want to, you know, two birds, one stone, pick the ones that you know are probably going to be on the quiz, like the CCC, NRA, AAA, like that. Yeah. Okay. And somebody in the last class asked us to talk about, bless you, I think. Do you want us to talk about the first New Deal or the second New Deal? Like, you know, pick whatever. You can pick a program from both. You can, or either. And I don't know that it's important that you make the distinction between the first and second, but you could, where the first is more about relief and the second is more like about fixing the system, you know, creating better system to operate within. So there you go. All right, do you want to hear anything else about this question? Do you have any other concerns about it? Or you guys started it? Have you thought about it? Got anything to say? Been watching you've been so busy watching the Supreme Court confirmation hearings that you probably haven't had a chance to work on stuff. I get it. I get it. Actually, I was yesterday, and my dad asked me, like, what are you doing? And I told him, he goes, why are you doing that? I went, Dad, what do I do for a living? He goes, yeah, I still wouldn't do it. My dad's a slacker. Okay, he's not. All right. So thanks for saying you had no questions. I appreciate it. All right. So let's look. Oh, maybe somebody has a question. Oh, that's beautiful. Just came back from voting. That's perfect. Good job. Yeah. Yeah, that's the way you need to do it. Yeah. So that could be your excuse for a lot of stuff. Over the next unit or so. It's like, no, I was too busy. I had to vote. I was researching, you know, all the stuff on the ballot. You know, you can go to your county website, voting plug, and it'll give you a copy of your ballot. And so that way you can kind of look at, because, you know, I mean, I'm pretty involved at voting and like to pay attention to stuff. And I can't think of an election that I ever missed since I've been 18, because, you know, this stuff matters to me. But almost every time I go to vote, there's that one race. It's like, I didn't know we were electing dog catcher in Williamson County. And, you know, it gives you Republican or Democrats. Like, who do I want catching the dogs, a Republican or a Democrat? How do I know? So, or, you know, sometimes school board, that sort of stuff. So it'll give you a list of all the races you're voting on. And that way you can go do a little research. And one of my friends like does that, fills it out, and then takes it with them. Fred, my doctor's calling me. Do I want to talk to her? No. Okay. Oh my God. Okay, sorry. I had to look. If it were the hospital, I would answer and put this on pause. But yeah, research the voting thing. I like that. Good job, though. Way to vote. Good job. All right. I kind of think, I mean, I've been reading, there's all sorts of records being set as far as voter registration this time around, and I bet we have a very high level of participation. This is an unusual election, to be sure. I know people are saying it's the most important one in US history. I don't know, but it is a big deal. That would be a good question. Most important election in US history. Wonder what? I would almost say 1860. Although there would be people that argued, you know, it's when Jefferson got elected and we had the first transfer of power. I don't know. 1860 is the one that brought Lincoln in, which led to the Civil War. I'm not blaming Lincoln. All right, maybe it's 32, because that gave us the stuff we're talking about today. All right, I feel like we've talked about all this stuff to this point where we got to the chart. So just gentle reminder about the chart. Doesn't list every New Deal agency, because how big would that chart be? But it does list some fairly important parts of the first and second New Deal. What you'll notice is the 1933 ones typically create jobs, hand out some money, and fix the most broken parts of our system, which might be agriculture or creation of agricultural and industrial jobs, plus fixing banks. So bank fixing, that sounds terrible. And you'll also notice creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. But again, these aren't all the agencies, but there's some of the agencies. And a lot of them do the same things. It's just their emphasis will be different. Like if you look at this PWA 1933, they build really good stuff, like really high quality stuff, but they don't build as much of it. the WPA builds a whole bunch more stuff. Plus, they even pay kids to grade papers for their teachers. Oh my goodness, we need to bring that thing back. And they would pay like high school kids to go visit people in the nursing homes, which is cool, except during COVID, we can't do that. But WPA really is about the number of people that were employed and getting more money into the economic system. And PWA was really more of an emphasis on the quality of the work. Smaller program, bigger program. And the goal here, again, just to get the money out there. Yeah, which some people will complain about. All right. So many New Deal programs and a few major phases. And of course, the three overall goals of the New Deal are relief, recovery, and reform. And you see some of that in each phase of the New Deal, although the later we get into the New Deal, the more there's an emphasis on reform. Okay. All right, so first New Deal, more of a focus on relief, emergency banking, creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates stock and stock trades. CCC, which I've mentioned more than once, and I've told you is on the quiz, really popular because it's very productive and takes rowdy dudes out of the city and gives them positive things to do. Look again about why the NRA and AAA are declared unconstitutional. It's going to come up again in this lecture, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Because there's another point where they talk about it related to Supreme Court reform and unemployment. What's kind of interesting is even with all of these programs and billions of dollars being spent, and billion with the B was a really big amount of money back then. Now, could be your local school board spends that much, I don't know. But, it's different, much less inflation, of course. Unemployment was still 20%. Now, I think right now it's about 8 to 10%, depending on where you live. And that's, in the middle of a pandemic. So 20% unemployment is pretty high. In some farm states, it was as high as 50% in the 1930s. So unemployment is it's the problem. It's the problem during that time period, because it's not that people didn't want to take a job, and it's not like you got paid, you had an unemployment check. You didn't have one. There were no jobs. I mean, it's an enormous problem, and it's a problem. I mean, we've not had this problem to that scale before or since, thankfully. So the economy shows some improvement, but a lot of times the only jobs that were created were the ones that were created by the government. And when people are spending money, they're still buying old inventories of consumer goods, or they're buying food, but we've overproduced food. And a lot of the jobs, as I've already mentioned, are lost in the agricultural sector, because so many farms are abandoned during this time period, and the only people who are really keeping their farms probably were not in as bad a shape. So the other farmer, and even if you kept your farm, you probably let go a lot of your farm workers. So the economy does show some improvement, but the one thing that you see as a big change is what people expect the government to do. And the expectation that the government would intervene in the economy had changed irrevocably. It'll never go back. You could not revoke it. Cannot go back. All right, some fancy college words. All right, second New Deal, 35 to 38, more of a focus on economic security. So bigger jobs program, WPA, Wagner Act, which replaces AAA, Social Security, you know what that is. It's for old folks, gives them a little cash each month. And REA, and also you'll notice TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, they do similar things. But this is to get electricity to folks in the country that did not have electricity. 80% of people, country-ish farmers, didn't have electricity beginning of the 30s. 90% of people will by the end of this program. So that's a very impressive rate of success, and that creates a big change in everyday life for people in the country. It does. And that creates stuff like PEC, which is where, you know, where I live, out this way, Leander Cedar Parkway. That's where we get our electricity. So we still directly benefit from that. So good job, REA and TVA and Colorado River Authority and all that stuff. Okay. Did everybody like the New Deal? No. Does everybody like anything? No. Not even everybody likes chocolate, which I don't understand. All right. Here's 3 important critics of the New Deal. There are more, like Republicans. Let's go with that because it's a Democratic, it's the Democrats' plan. However, you know, certainly they're going to be cooperative with it. And if you look at congressional votes during this time period, almost always, if a program was working, whether you were a Democrat or Republican, you would vote to fund it or extend it. So, but there are going to be Republicans that argue with the philosophy that the government should intervene in such a big way. None of these critics are going to argue that. These are going to be critics who argue that the government either isn't intervening enough or is intervening in an improper way, like they're helping the wrong people. So here we go. Huey Long. Now, book review wise, if you ever wanted to read a book about Huey Long, I think that would be appropriate. He's a pretty wild dude. There's no doubt. Hey, I got to stop and check something really quick. Okay, I'm good. I couldn't remember if I'd started recording and I couldn't see it on the screen. So let me go back to the notes. Sorry. Goodness, you get old, you forget stuff. All right, so Huey Long, Louisiana, governor and then senator. He'd been other things before that. If there's any corrupt thing you can do politically, Huey Long's done it at least twice. He knows something about you, or you know something about him, or he can bribe you. He knows all the stuff he needs to know in the state of Louisiana to the point where he's going to get elected with regularity. Personal life is pretty wild, and he has a lot of political influence. And the reason he rises to some prominence during this time period is when FDR is running for president in 32. There's some concern among the Democrats that picking a New York City fellow as your candidate isn't going to be very appealing to people who live in the South, who always vote for Democrats. So we don't want to get those people to stop voting for Democrats. So the FDR campaign asked Huey Long to campaign for FDR in the South. So he ran the campaign in the South and was very effective. That led him to the idea that maybe he should run for president. So he decides he is going to run against FDR in 1936 for the Democratic nomination. And he's going to do that because he doesn't believe that the New Deal helps country people or Southern people enough. He thinks that it really helps the non-farming states more than the farming states. And there's certainly some empirical evidence that might suggest that. There's also the possibility that just overall the Great Depression was harder in the agricultural sector than it was the industrial sector. I think that's possible. But anyway, all right. So Huey Long is going to suggest a really interesting tax scheme, which I think would not go over well in the modern era. But everyone who makes more than $1 million, that first dollar and any dollar after 1 million gets taxed at 100%. That's all. The government just takes your money if you earn over $1 million. Now, this did not apply if you inherited money. So this was on incomes, not inheritance or wealth. So, so it goes over this way. It doesn't offend really rich people, but it really affects people who are currently making a lot of money. this idea was pretty popular. And if you're thinking, well, I don't understand that, they're just jealous. No, it's the Great Depression. So the thought is anybody who's making that much money is doing something they shouldn't do. They're taking advantage of the rest of the country. They're just horrible. It's horrible if you're making more than $1 million in the middle of the Great Depression. It's like probably how, I don't know, maybe it's how you would have felt 4 or 5 months ago about the people who made a lot of money selling toilet paper when you couldn't find any. Do you remember when everybody was buying toilet paper? Can you buy toilet paper now? Is it better? Or those wipes, like the Clorox wipes or whatever else. Oh my gosh, hand sanitizer. I know I've told you too many times I run the little soccer league. People would steal our hand sanitizer. Can you imagine? And our hand soap. Crud. What are people thinking? Okay, so back to the business. So confiscation of annual incomes over $1 million and limits on inheritance. Now, they also, in the Share Our Wealth Society, said everyone should have $5,000 to buy a house, which would have been a very nice house during that time period. Not a mansion, but really solid place to live. And in some parts of the country, really nice. And $2,500 annual income, which was way above anything that you would have considered minimum wage. Yeah, thanks for the sympathy on the hand sanitizer there. I appreciate it. All right. Now, the Democrats were nervous about Huey Long. They really thought he would take votes away from FDR. And Huey Long's super popular in the South. He runs for Senate so he can get a national platform. And then he gets assassinated as he leaves a Senate hearing one night. So he doesn't get to run for president in 36. Your book talks a little about the assassination. Some constituent who held a grudge. There were always rumors that maybe the president's people paid the guy to do it, that sort of thing, but I don't think that's true. But those are interesting rumors. The Democrats were nervous about him, though. And his group was really popular. And the popularity of that group and that movement were really based upon Huey Long personally. You know, he was a charismatic fellow. So I do think if you like politics and don't know anything about Huey Long, I think he would be interesting to read about. And, you know, Louisiana, they're our neighbor. So kind of interesting to read about corruption just, you know, down the road. So, and Huey Long, interesting guy because, you know, very corrupt for sure, but also probably helped a lot of people, which is a weird combination, isn't it? All right. So those ideas don't become part of the Democratic Party platform. However, you do hear them echoed from time to time by presidential candidates or important people in business. I think the most recent person we heard that from, who was a politician, was Andrew Yang, who briefly, along with 25 other people, ran to be president or ran for the Democratic Party nomination. And then I think Mark Cuban likes to talk about this. He's the guy that owns the Dallas Mavericks, I think. Yeah, it's a basketball team. So he talks about everybody getting a couple $1,000s a week for income until the pandemic ends. I know most of us go like, yeah, I wouldn't mind that. I guess the trick is, thanks, Mavericks. Yeah, the trick is always, you know, that has to be paid back. Not by you individually, but by your country. So tricky stuff. All right. Dr. Francis Townsend, it's a dude. Back in the old days, Francis was a really common name. And here's your trivia for the day. Francis with an I was always a dude, and Francis with an E was always a girl. Yeah, there's trivia for the day. Yeah, like I have a nice stepmom. Her name is Sandy, and that used to be a guy's name as well. So Sandy with a Y was always a guy, and Sandy EY or IE was a girl. Okay, back to Francis Townsend. He was a medical doctor, lived in California. Older fellow in his 60s. Back then, your life expectancy was right about 60. So he was older in his 60s, and he got cancer. and somehow recovered, you know, whether it's a treatment or miracle or, you know, who can say, but he recovered in an era where there really were not good treatments for cancer. And I know some of you go, there's not good ones now. That's true. Pretty much any treatment for cancer is pretty heinous, but there are treatments. You know, there are certain types of cancer that if you catch them at the right time and treat them with the right stuff, there's a good chance of survival. That was not the truth back in the 30s. So Townsend survives, and then he's reflecting, and he says, you know, if I hadn't had money and connections, no way I would have survived this. Most old people would have just died. So he thinks we might want to do something to help old people that might help young people as well. And so his plan is to take old people out of the workforce by giving them a monthly pension. And if they get the monthly pension, they have to agree either not to work or not to work too much. And they have to agree to spend all the money. So it has to be a monthly pension that's substantial enough that it helps old people justify getting out of the workforce, but it can't be so substantial that they'll just hoard it and not spend it, because you want to also improve the economy. And the other bonus here is they're out of the workforce, so then younger people can take their jobs. So there you go. And Townsend also said we should build in a provision that gives medical care for older people, which, you know, you're probably familiar with the idea of Medicare. I always get Medicare and Medicaid backwards. I think it's Medicare. But that tells you I'm not on it. I'm not as old as I look, maybe. But that'll happen later. But this suggestion turns into Social Security. And so the American people, as a rule, are in favor of this. And I guess we should talk about Social Security. Maybe now is a good time. Maybe. I don't know. It was created during this time period. But Social Security, I think during this era, kicked in when you were 62. Life expectancy was about 60. So they're kind of hedging their bets a little bit there that, you know, not everybody would get it, which of course is always true. And that you would pay in, and that money would be put into not an individual account, but into just a fund, a Social Security fund, and that fund would be used to pay out to the people who withdrew the Social Security. And when they created the program, they estimated that for every 5 or 6 people taking, or excuse me, for every 1 person taking out of Social Security, 5 to 6 people would be paying in. So the idea was that you would continue to save all the extra money for later on in case the ratio changed, which it has. The ratio has changed pretty dramatically. So I think when I first started working, it was more 4 to 1. Now it's about 2.5 to 1 pretty soon. When the rest of the baby boomers retire, which will be in the next 5 years or so, it'll be 2 to 1. Goodness. And then pretty soon, I think we're all just going to have an old person live with us. I think it'll be cheaper. So, and of course, the issue with Social Security, 2 issues. One, they haven't dramatically raised the age at which you can collect Social Security. It's either 62 for early, 65, or you can delay to 67. But life expectancy is way beyond that now, thankfully. So that means we're paying out a lot more because a bunch of people live longer, which is good. I'm not saying it's good. And the other problem, of course, you have to know this, Congress never, ever, not even when it was designed, saved the extra money. They just spent it. And it didn't matter which party was in power. There was no Social Security fund. They just put it back into the general fund and spent it. Sort of like Texas does with the lottery money. So, yeah. Only on a much bigger scale. All right, there's my happy Social Security talk. So, will you ever get Social Security? I wouldn't count on it, but you never know. You might vote for politicians who fix it. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Will you? And if you're wondering, like, why don't politicians fix it? This will be my plug for voting again. Here's why politicians don't fix it. Are you paying attention, young people? People under, you're all young, like under 40, under 30, under 20, some of you. Because you know what old people do all the time? They just vote. I think they're looking for elections. Like, I hope there's an election today. I want to vote for dog catcher. They don't care. They just vote because old people, they got free time and they have time to study the issues. So there's nobody that wants to get reelected that says, hey, I think it's time to cut Social Security because all the dang old people kick them out of office. You know what I'm saying? So politicians know that old people vote in much higher percentages than young people. That's why most of the laws benefit old people and are hard on young people because you got to vote. I'm just saying. I know it seems unfair. You'd think they would just do what was best for everyone, but no. All right. Do you want to hear more about voting or Charles Coughlin? Let's talk about him. All right. Charles Coughlin was the radio priest. He had a big radio show, which is the main means of entertainment and communication during this time period. And he, ouch, 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 he had about 30 million listeners, which is a really big radio program. It's about a third of all the working adults. It's a lot of people. When Roosevelt first came on the scene, he was very pro-Roosevelt. It's like, we got to vote for FDR. It's Roosevelt or ruin. He's the only guy that can save us. So it's like, go Team Roosevelt. And then after the first New Deal and the second New Deal, he looked at it. He said, you know what? These New Deal programs really aren't helping the average person. They're just helping people that don't really need help, like big businessmen and big farmers and Wall Streeters and bankers. And then, just to be completely inappropriate, he adds in, and most of those people are Jewish. So he's an anti-Semitic dude, anti-Jewish dude. He says that FDR is in league with the Jews, and that's the only group he really wants to help. Okay, so that's also a gentle reminder to us. We'll talk about it much more in the next section, that anti-Semitism isn't just a German thing. They're part of, when the Great Depression happens, people are gonna blame the Jews. They are. We'll talk about why later, but that's also why this anti-Semitism doesn't upset people maybe as much as it would in the modern era. I'm certain it would. Well, I'm pretty certain. Hope so. You like to think that if people pick a race or ethnicity of people to dislike and they speak out against them because of their race or ethnicity, that we'd all be opposed. All right, more stuff. Okay, so Foner by this point. Hopefully you've read the book a little bit. The title of the book, Give Me Liberty. So he's always talking about what does liberty or what does freedom mean to different groups. So he's going to talk about freedom of contract being a liberty that concerns the Supreme Court during this era. So, So the Supreme Court is concerned and overturns the AAA and NRA because they think that it violates freedom of contract and liberty, that individual businesses don't get to make a lot of their own decisions about their businesses, what to produce, where to sell it, that sort of thing. And that also both of those laws allow executive branch and federal interference in intrastate commerce within one state. They certainly recognize the Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce between different states, but they don't think that the government has the right to dictate state law about commerce, which is kind of interesting. Okay, that's why FDR gets mad and says, you know what, you old people are out of touch. We need to reform the Supreme Court. So he introduces something called the Supreme Court Reform Plan, which would have potentially added 6 new judges to the Supreme Court. His opponents refer to that as court packing, which is a phrase you're hearing right now in the news. Probably if you turned it on right now, you would hear that phrase, which both parties are accusing each other of right now. But during this era, it really very specifically meant adding new judges to the Supreme Court so you could get what you want. Yeah. Yeah, 6 or 5. Okay, yeah, because the deal with the adding the judges, thanks for pointing that out, was the court reform plan said that every judge over the age of 70 should retire. And if they didn't, then the current administration had the ability to add an additional judge for every judge over the age of 70 who did not retire. So it could have been 5 or 6. Now, by the time FDR is done with the presidency, he's actually gotten to appoint 6 judges, which is a lot. But remember, he gets elected to 4 terms. Your current president, I think, has done, hasn't he appointed 3? Which is incredible in 4 years. That's really unusual, which is why it's so controversial right now. But I mean, you don't always get to plan those things, do you? With lifetime appointments, excuse me. But the Supreme Court reform plan, or court packing, FDR thought was a good idea because he was frustrated that the AAA and NRA had been declared unconstitutional, and he said these guys don't understand modern times and what society needs, and they're ruling by old antiquated processes, that sort of thing. Congress wasn't in favor of this, so FDR appealed directly to the American people and said, hey guys, call your congressman and tell them what you think. The American people agreed with Congress. It's too much power, to allow the president to reform, not reform, but reform, to create essentially a new Supreme Court. And so the court reform plan did not pass. The court does begin to see liberty in a new way, where the government's supposed to protect health, safety, morals, and welfare of the American population by the end of the 30s, but also several judges resign because they're old, and a couple die. The court also never declares another part of the New Deal to be unconstitutional. So it's either they change their mind, the format of the court changes, or they also get FDR's frustration and don't want to risk it. And it's probably a combination of all of those things. All right, I'm going to stop for just a second to see if you have any questions, and then we'll go over the even more depressing part of this, perhaps. Okay. All right, do you guys have any questions? Is there anything you want to ask thus far? Goodness. I'm sorry, you can probably tell my shoulder really hurts. So, dang, it's getting old thing, not cool. All right, let's wrap it up, and then we'll talk about anything else you want to talk about. Okay, so as far as different groups of folks, how does the New Deal treat them? Yeah, the overall goal of the New Deal is to combat the poverty of the era, to change the system, that sort of stuff. It definitely does not have any sort of goal to improve racial or ethnic equality, or to help women. It doesn't do that. So if you were expecting those changes, you're not in the right era. But you'll see the beginnings of changes, I think, that just happen a little more organically. They're not necessarily happening because of laws, but you will also see a few people in this administration who think that those changes are as important as fixing the economy. Now, not very many people, and they're not always elected. However, they're still influential. So, conservation becomes more important. And it's not necessarily because everybody thinks we got to save the planet. It's because it's good for the economy. Farming sector is really harmed by something called the Dust Bowl. There's a ton of stuff written about the Dust Bowl and conservation during this era. You could read those things for book review. There was one summer that I taught, and almost every kid wanted to read some book about the Dust Bowl. What I found out later is that their English teacher, they all went to Westwood, and their English teacher had assigned some book about the Dust Bowl in their English class. So their thought was, 2 birds, 1 stone. And I looked at the book and I said, this is a terrible idea, because it was by, I can't remember the name of the author, but he had been the New York Times environmental correspondent and had no background in history. So to read it for a history book, you would have to be willing to critique his historical assessment, not necessarily his environmental assessment, which they were either unwilling or unable to do. So it was tricky. But anyway, if you're going to argue during this, and the main argument of that book was that FDR is like the first environmentalist, and that he had real concern with preserving the environment. It's like, I think he had a real concern with fixing the economy. And if you got to do that by fixing the environment, bonus. But I don't think that was his major concern. However, farmers in the Midwest and the Great Plains had really overfarmed. They hadn't rested their fields, and they hadn't planted things that were crops that were complementary. They were really just planting things they could sell. So they weren't thinking about the health of the soil. Then we end up with a drought, and literally the topsoil just blows away because it's all worn out. It's not kind of anchored down with any sort of plants that have a root system that help it out. So the topsoil literally blows away. So it's got to rebuild, before the farmland can be productive again. So that's going to happen. Nature will take care of that if you, leave the fields alone. And you really don't have a choice when stuff won't grow and the topsoil blows away. This period of drought is also followed by a period of flooding. So really devastating in the middle of the country on top of the Great Depression. But the CCC, Social Conservation Service, WPA, all had projects to plant trees, dam rivers, restore eroded land. So really to help people in those local areas that were dramatically affected by these conservation-related and weather-related issues. Things certainly go together. I am not saying that these things weren't important for the environment. I'm saying that that was probably not the major concern of the people who designed the plan. But a very fine side effect. Not saying, yeah, okay. All right. Women more involved in politics during this time period. FDR is going to appoint the first female Secretary of Labor, and some advisors. Marian Anderson, she wasn't an advisor. Mary McLeod Bethune was an advisor, as she's the pretty famous educator from the time period. There'll be a famous College of Education with Bethune Cookman College in DC, that's named after her. She'll be the head of the NYA and part of the WPA, also African-American woman. And Marian Anderson. The Marian Anderson thing really happens in part because of Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady, played a really big role in politics, even though she was not appointed or elected. But, she's the wife of the president. And, because of his physical limitations, she was probably much more active. She was more active in traveling and that sort of stuff. He really had a passion for helping poor communities, improving their infrastructure, school systems, that sort of thing. That was especially true in the Appalachian regions. She had a lot of personal projects that she oversaw through the federal government. She's concerned about health and medical care, education, but also civil rights. And you saw that with the Marian Anderson situation. Marian Anderson was a pretty famous singer, opera singer primarily of the day. Eleanor Roosevelt was from, an old wealthy family that could trace its roots back to the American Revolution. So she was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. They had an annual conference, which she didn't always attend as First Lady because she was busy. They were having it one year in Philadelphia at the Constitution Hall. Constitution Hall was segregated, and Marian Anderson was Black. I really need to study this more to find out how in the world they didn't completely realize she was Black. Now, I've seen pictures of her. She's fair-skinned, but also during this time period, you probably knew her more over the radio and didn't really see her. So whoever booked her wasn't paying close enough attention. Nobody really was. And then closer to the event, they realized what they'd done and told her, you can't sing here. This is a segregated place. So they dismissed her, said, you can't sing here. And then Eleanor Roosevelt read about it. It's like, I'm not going to be part of some racist group. And she quit. She quit the DAR. And then she arranged for a concert, Marian Anderson, to sing at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in a public concert. So that made a huge effect on African Americans. They just went, oh, somebody in a high place is kind of, at least on the surface, on our side. And this will be the era. Crud, I needed to say this in the last class. I'll make sure I talk about this later. This is the era where African Americans switch their votes. Before this time period, like 1864, 1868 and beyond, African Americans always voted for Republicans up through 1932. But after the first round of the New Deal and after Eleanor Roosevelt does this thing, African Americans as a group tend to switch their vote to the Democrat Party. And it's in large part because of Eleanor Roosevelt, Marian Anderson, and it's not the only thing, but also because the New Deal does help African Americans, not equally, not completely, not even fairly. And also FDR has African American advisors. We also mentioned, we already mentioned McLeod Bethune, but also he'll have another group of advisors referred to as the Black Cabinet. Now, he doesn't always listen to them or take their advice, but he does listen to them. Now, how did the New Deal treat African Americans? Not fairly. I know you weren't expecting equality yet, and you're not going to get it, but included in many New Deal programs. But the NRA, National Recovery Administration, allowed separate pay scales for Blacks and whites in major industries. So you could have the Black minimum wage and the white minimum wage, and I'll let you guess the difference in the scales. Alternate nickname for that program, oh, I didn't mention this in the last class, and remember, this is proper during their time period, but a lot of African American politicians referred to the NRA as Negro robbed again. Again, not proper in this time period, but in that time period, that would have been an okay thing to say. Alternative nickname was that. Business and Southern pressure pushes an exclusion of agricultural workers, domestic workers, female heads of household with dependents, child care workers out of Social Security. So that way employers didn't have to match the 7% that employees paid in. So this meant that very large classifications of workers in the South who were primarily people of color, so sharecroppers, didn't get Social Security. If you cooked and cleaned, took care of people's kids, you didn't get Social Security. So this is going to be very large percentages of very poor people who will be not allowed to participate in Social Security. And then the book does a really good job, and you may or may not have an appreciation for this, but the book does a really good job of trying to explain how societal pressure kind of deemed some New Deal programs as good and wholesome, and others as immoral and lazy. And the truth is, the programs that tended to help the poorest people, rather than just kind of your average middle class people, were the ones that were deemed more immoral and amoral or lazy. And the book talks about kind of how that worked. And that also is going to lead to a stigma of accepting help from those programs. So the New Deal certainly is an opening for equality, and you see instances of it, but you also see some old things that aren't going away. A few more things, then we'll stop and see what questions you have. If you're wondering, does anything good happen for Native Americans? Does anything good ever? Okay, maybe, sort of, kind of, and then no. So the Indian New Deal is created, which is it really reverses the Dawes Act and restores tribal autonomy. What it doesn't do is give resources. So it ends boarding schools. It allows for automatic citizenship for Native Americans, so they don't have to do application, that sort of thing. Tribal autonomy, so they get to make rules and government structures on the reservations. So they're going to get more control over what happens, but they're going to have less money. And also, after 50 years of implementation of Dawes, their tribal culture has been lost. So they're going to have to work really hard to regain it in the middle of a Great Depression. So you'll really see this tribal renaissance happen after World War II. So you'll see changes that are enabled by this, but they don't happen at that time because there's just no resources. And the culture's changed, so they've got to try to revive it. For Mexican Americans, this is not a good decade for Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants. And I think you could say that anytime the economy is bad in the United States, like it's not going to go well for Mexican Americans or Mexicans. So there's a push to, or encouragement, as the book will say, to relocate, deport lots of people to Mexico. So depends on whose numbers you like, but about 400 to 500,000 folks are going to be taken from the United States and relocated against their will, deported. But this is without formal procedure. So they don't go to hearings or that sort of thing. Just immigration sweeps where immigration agents, they don't have really a formal title, I don't think, during that time period, just go essentially to day labor sites. And if people could not prove that they were citizens, they just took them and put them on trains and sent them to Mexico City. Because the government got a really good price on train trips to Mexico City. So if you're wondering, like, how could you prove during that time period that you were here legally? Probably your birth certificate's it. And nobody carries that around because, you know, it's too early for everybody to have a driver's license. And immigration's not regulated quite strictly enough during that era that you would have a work permit or green card, that sort of thing. So lots of people who got deported had never lived anywhere but the United States. So it's going to be an enormous problem, which will lead to a lot of distrust by Mexican Americans toward the federal government. And you'll see that, there's attempts during this era to try to form agricultural worker unions, which are suppressed pretty strongly, which is why Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta later on are so important in this movement, and also the development of the American GI Forum, because even though we're going to draft enormous numbers of Mexican Americans, they're not going to be accepted into the veterans of foreign wars. So yeah, it's not the best time for Mexican Americans. Communism, however, trendy. So you could be a communist or socialist. It'd be respectable and okay to talk about and okay to join groups and clubs. However, later on, when we don't like communism and socialism as much because you have Stalin. So after World War II, this is going to create issues for people who were doing something that was completely acceptable in the 1930s. Especially acceptable at colleges where there were lots of socialist and communist debating societies where they had really interesting discussions, and food. Free food is going to be real. It's always important when you're in college. So those events were pretty highly attended. So later on, when people are going to say, like, I know you were at that communist group in college, and people are going to be denigrated because of it, it's like, yeah, I was there for the free food. But people also really openly discussed the different economic systems because everybody's broke. It's the Great Depression, so it makes sense. Also, some of the New Deal programs, um, Dorothea Lange is really the photographer of the New Deal, so almost anybody you see in a photograph of the Dust Bowl is probably one of her photographs. And there were lots of New Deal programs that interviewed former slaves. They had the forget exactly what they're called, but the slave, it's not diaries, but slave records. Now, those are they're more than a little controversial because you mostly had white college students interviewing former slaves in the South. So you had the Northern Southern thing, you had the white black thing, you had the formally educated, less formally educated thing. And a lot of the recording was done in dialect, which you look at. I mean, they recorded them also orally, which was good. But the transcripts that the college kids wrote, you would look at how they wrote them and you go like, well, that just seems racist. It would to us. And in their era, I'm not sure that they would have thought of it that way. However, popular film during that time period promoted the dignity of the working man, person who tried to work, common man who's trying to take care of his family, or common person, because it was about women as well. Also, African Americans like Charles Hamilton Houston and Paul Robeson will challenge the line of color. I'll mention quickly who they are in case you want to pick them, book about them for book review. Charles Hamilton Houston is a law graduate of Harvard University. He will start a law school at Howard University, which is a traditionally Black college. And the whole goal of that law school is to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. His most important student, I think he probably would have agreed with this, would be Thurgood Marshall. So Charles Hamilton Houston designs the legal strategy to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson and eventually heads up the legal team for the NAACP. He couldn't be more important. He's hugely, hugely important. And Paul Robeson, he had a law degree from Cornell, but he didn't work as a lawyer. He worked as opera singer, which is an interesting thing. He also had played football professionally. So he's a very unusually gifted person, also African American. Hugely popular entertainer who would not give a concert unless the audience was integrated. So if you got Paul Robeson, you did not get segregation. And because of his popularity, he had a lot of concerts in places that normally would not have desegregated audiences. Later on, he's going to really speak out for labor unions across the world and will be seen a little more as a communist than probably was good for him, because he thinks that philosophy promotes equality more. And it will end up getting he'll get blacklisted where he can't get jobs, and they'll take his passport away. So he really kind of gets written out of history in a lot of ways, but he is a fascinating guy. The Scottsboro Boys incident, also fascinating but sad. I think I've talked about this a little bit before. Kind of a hobo tradition in the South and the Midwest where when they talk about hobos in this context, it's very specifically people who go from one town to another by hopping on a cargo train. So clearly they're trespassing. But they're going from one town to another looking for work. It's usually mechanical or agricultural kind of work. People would self-segregate when they were hobos. So you'd have the black car of hobos and the white car, actually the car of black hobos and the car of white hobos. They also had hobo prostitutes apparently during this time period because I will not speculate, but everybody's got to make a living. So there were 2 young white female hobo prostitutes on this train in Scottsboro, Alabama, who were, making money. And as they were leaving the car of African Americans, the police had stopped the train and they got caught. So rather than go to jail for being hobo prostitutes, they said that the African American men had kidnapped and raped them. You know how that's going to turn out. And that's how it turned out. They were all sentenced to death. Then the women recanted and it took a very long time. I think it was 12 years to get those guys out of jail, and a couple of them died in jail. So there you go. Goodness. All right, but there are lots of things written about Scottsboro Boys. So in the last class, I know there's a professor at LSU that wrote a couple of books about the Scottsboro Boys, and one was like a really thick, scholarly, like 600-page thing, and one was a more like, I just want to know stuff about a 200-page version, but for the life of me, I can't remember the name of that guy. I've got the book upstairs. I know I do because I've read it, but I'm not going to go out and get it. But you could read about Charles Hamilton Houston, which would be, he's hugely important. Paul Robeson, who's hugely interesting, and the Scottsboro Boys, which is hugely depressing. Any of those things for your book review. Or if you like photography, read a Dorothea Lange book. I mean, because they'll definitely slide some pictures in there too, so you'll get a chance to look at. I'm not saying to be just a picture book. She's important as well. So, or Marian Anderson or Eleanor Roosevelt would be fascinating because she's not just, the first lady who did some really nice things for poor people and people of color, to try to create equality. And I don't mean that in a patrician sort of way. But she also, you'll find out that she might have been the very first prominent person. No, that's probably not the right way to say it. We'll just say the Roosevelts had a really weird family life. We'll just go with that, where they greatly admired and respected, and I think loved each other, but they weren't exclusive, shall we say. And I think most people who get married, I speak just really for myself here, and I think I know my husband felt the same way, tend to appreciate exclusivity in the marriage. But there's some people who don't, and as long as you're both on the same page, good job. But you need to be on the same page with that. Mr. Roosevelt tended to have long-term relationships with other people. Mrs. Roosevelt, shorter term, and she also with men or women. And with Mr. Roosevelt is primarily, well, no, it was always with women, and primarily with one. So you could read about their family life, and that would be pretty fascinating too. And I always think about this stuff. Sorry, I know we're almost out of time, but I always think about this stuff when we argue about what kind of person we want to pick for the presidency. Should they be a good moral person? And I suppose ideally we always want a good moral person, however we define that. But there were certainly good and moral things that the Roosevelts did, even though their lifestyle is not traditional in any way. I mean, it just isn't. So I don't know. And we can look at, we'll just pick somebody less controversial and not recent. Bill Clinton, you've probably heard of him. I would say that he and his wife probably didn't have the same agreement, but he seemed to think that marriage was kind of a more loose construction, we'll say. And we'll also say dated a little bit outside the marriage. But most people look at his presidency and go like, he did good things for the economy. So I don't know. I mean, ideally we want everyone to be perfect in every aspect of their lives. Practically, it just doesn't happen. Yeah. I'm not saying you shouldn't strive for it. You vote however you want to vote. I'm not saying. I'm just saying we've certainly had people who aren't super nice people who've done great stuff. But we've also had great people do great stuff. I mean, I think, in a lot of ways, like Abraham Lincoln, super nice guy, not perfect, but super nice guy. Worked through a lot of struggles, but did some really important things. All right, I'm done talking about that. Do you guys have questions and or comments? And then I'll kind of double check on the roll. All right, I'm gonna name names. It's like we're getting ready for Red Scare round 2. Victoria Alvarez, the names I'm naming are people I did not count as present. So Victoria Alvarez, Isaiah Castilla, I need more light in here, Marcos Cervantes, and if any of you are here, just shout it out or type it in the chat. Eric Constantino, Joshua Contreras, Miracle Curry, Seja, whose name I can't say, Micah Laborde, Christian Limon, Jocelyn Rodriguez, and that's it. Everyone else I think is here. So I'm gonna check in the chat. And all right. I don't know if you guys have questions. I would look at the list of things to study before you take the quiz. And when you go to take the quiz, if it's not available, please send me an email. I think I fixed it, but I'm still, yeah, not so great with the Blackboard related technology. Google Classroom was so much easier, I'm just saying. All right, so stay and ask questions if you have them. I wish you good luck on all of your assignments. Hope you have a lovely day. Appreciate that you came. Take care of yourselves. Good luck. Thanks for coming. Ask questions if you have them.
Professor Simon.
Yes.
So whenever, like, if we choose to take the test, like, tomorrow, when is the deadline time again?
It's midnight.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. No problem.
Excuse me, I can have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So with chapter 19, I know the reasons for the U.S. joining into World War I is because just the Zimmerman telegram and the thing of Lusitania
That thing,
pushed.
yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know. What was it, like another reason?
No, I think the Zimmerman telegram's the main thing. Plus, you know, England had kind of been pressuring us, but the Lusitania and the other ships that were being sunk also was kind of a sign. Yeah.
Okay, and because I'm working two computers. I'm doing Zoom on my laptop while trying to write it.
Understood.
So, for I think chapter 20 question. So I know we're gonna start. We talk about the 1930s, about the depression.
Yes.
But my thing, I'm trying to figure out, would it be easier just to write, or be specific for the laws? What laws? Because I can't find your notes on Blackboard.
Yeah, those should be in the
Because I'm trying to use my book, but I'm trying to one by one first.
Yeah, because that's the part that probably isn't going to be quite as, I mean, there's not going to be a section in your book that says, if they'd had these laws, it would have worked out better. So this is more your thought about it. And my notes should be in the group, in the course documents section, and just, it'll say lecture notes, I think. And I think I've got those listed by chapter, but what I was really trying to get at there is that there weren't any laws to regulate how you traded stock or how banks loaned money. Like, did they have to have collateral? Can you borrow money to buy stock?
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, can you?
I'll see the literal laws. Okay.
Yeah, because it's really more about them not having any laws. So that was kind of the issue, I think. List of things for the test was also in the course documents, and it'll say like study suggestions for timed questions, I think.
Okay, then I think I'm good with that.
Okay, good. Okay. All right.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking questions. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, I'm still recording.